Hello, I'm Stephan Schwartz. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Schwartz Report. This week I want to focus on something that I am finding increasingly concerning. I've been watching television and looking at stuff on my computer and reading social media. And what I see is this endless series of stories of Trump followers being called to commit acts of political violence while social media apps fill their minds with weaponized disinformation specifically designed to encourage them and make them feel victimized and resentful and stimulate violence. This confluence of modern technology and long established psychological manipulation techniques has produced something never before seen in the United States. And it's been going on for several years now. And it has a single source, ultimately. We're at a point where the judges are under threat. Their children are under threat. Prosecutors have to have security protection. The identity of jurors has to be kept secret. Why? Why is our legal system in such a state of assault? And I want to suggest to you that this really begins when Trump began to make calls for violence, first in January 6th, and then against election workers and others in the legal system, in the political system, to a point where, for instance, election workers by the score have been quitting their posts because they don't feel it's safe or that it's possible to have fair elections in their district anymore. Civil political violence, particularly the January 6th insurrection, has become one of the most notable features in the American political landscape. That's astonishing. Doesn't that strike you as strange? Do you remember another election that was like this? And two things stand out for me. First, how many Americans think such violence is justified? A year ago, a poll that I saw said that nearly 1 in 4 Americans believed political violence was justified to save the United States. Second, nearly all of these people define themselves as evangelical Christians. As the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, describes it, and I'm quoting them here, support for political violence jumps to even higher levels among Americans who believe that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump, 46%. Americans who hold a favorable view of Trump, 41% when they did the poll, also believe in the so-called replacement theory. Americans who affirm the core tenets of white Christian nationalism propose that God intended America to be the new promised land for white European Christians. 39%. Look at those numbers. How is it possible, I ask myself, that people who profess their deep faith in Jesus, claim to shape their lives by his teachings, how do they reconcile the proclivity for violence that's being recorded by the PRRI with his Sermon on the Mount as found in Matthew? Jesus could hardly be clearer. To quote him, You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you, take your shirt and hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Now, I don't know how much clearer that could get. And yet, most commentary on the alliance of this evangelical community with Trump and the Republican Party that he now controls center principally on the cohort's sense of victimization, feelings about gender and racial issues. I want to suggest, however, it's a deeper psychological mental health issue going on here. I've been doing research on this for some weeks now because it's become such a concern. And what I have discovered is that the charismatic power of authoritarianism is a manifestation of what I would call beingness. Now, beingness can't be exactly quantified, yet everybody who encounters it knows exactly what I mean, whether it's a religious leader, a politician, or a movie star. But when it goes beyond just charisma, beingness can have an authority that crosses from the individual to the social generality. And that's what I think is going on. A psychological linkage has developed between a charismatic individual and a cohort that expresses subordination to him because they see the leader as the personification of their psychological profiles. He isn't just their leader, he is them. And when this happens, it can become the seed crystal around which a zeitgeist arises, whether that individual has immediate real power or not. And the pattern is the same for good or ill. In this essay, unfortunately, I want to focus on the negative aspect, evil beingness, because that kind of beingness is what I think is impacting the very well-being of American society. Two examples in the 20th century stand out in this way. And I want to give you some historical examples so that I don't want to get into a political argument. I want to show that this is a trend which has happened before, not here, but in other countries. And the two examples that I would give you is the communist vision of Stalin and the race-based National Socialism of Hitler. Both took their countries and the world through changes that were violent breaks with the past, leaps into the unknown, similar in essence and intensity to the founders of religion, only in this case it was in a negative way. And you know, when you really begin to look at the history of the recent past, you have to ask yourself, how does a misfit like Hitler, he was just an enlisted man in the army, and he was a minor painter of no particular importance or fame, how does such a person become the leader of one of the great European peoples at a time of high civilization? Now, the first person, as I did research, that I saw who really understood this and got it was the psychiatrist Carl Jung. And he said that Hitler represents a kind of negative beingness that I want to address. He said that to appreciate how Hitler came to power, it was necessary to realize, and this is his quote, Hitler did not lead the German people, Hitler was the German people. He was the personification of a popular consensus. That sound familiar to what's happening to us in the United States today? For decades after Jung made that statement, the full import of what he meant just really wasn't appreciated because it was thought until years later, long after the Second World War, that Germans didn't really know about this final solution in the Holocaust. They were not really aware of the evil that was being perpetrated. But historian Robert Gilati, in 2001, after careful nonpartisan research, flatly contradicted that assumption and supported what Jung had said. He made it very clear. He said, the mass of ordinary Germans did know about the evolving terror of Hitler's Holocaust. Now, when you look at the people around Hitler, you see further confirmation. Albert Speer, the only member of Hitler's inner circle to plead guilty at the Nuremberg trials, was interviewed by Gita Sereni. She was asked, how did this happen? How did you find yourself willing to do these things? And his answer was, I asked myself time and again how much of it was a kind of auto-suggestion. One thing is certain. Everyone who worked closely with him for a long time was exceptionally dependent on him. However powerful they were in their own domain, close to him, they became small and timid. Does that sound familiar? As you listen to all these people around Trump talk about their allegiance, their obedience, does that stand out? How does a person who has no actual authority but presents themselves as an authority get people to do violent negative things that no one would predict they would do? And when many do it, it becomes something that literally changes society. That's the power of dark beingness. And I think it matters that we understand this far better than we do, far better than we're talking about. To understand how these linkages occur, we also need to understand how to neutralize them, because this dynamic, I would suggest to you, is at work again. Not in quite the same way. I don't quite know what the end will be, but the authoritarianism of one individual, which is shaping our society, is unbelievably clear and irrefutable. Something little noted by politicians or the corporate media is happening not just in America, but in countries all over the world, and that's another part of this. We're not the only ones where this is happening. There is a disruption of the social order and the rise of authoritarianism and increasing political violence. And it's going on all over the world. Consider this. Between 2002 and 2022, the number of nations ruled by authoritarianism has risen from 13 to 42. The Varieties of Democracy Institute, the VDEM as it's called, at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, is one of the few scholarly institutions that has been studying this explicit trend, and their findings I find particularly notable and revealing. Stephan Lindberg, the Institute's director, reports, a democratic decline has taken place globally, and an increasing number of people are living in closed autocracies. The level of democracy enjoyed by the average world citizen in 2022 is back to 1986 levels. This means that 72% of the world's population, 5.7 billion people today, live under authoritarian rule. 5.7 billion people. To understand how an individual can transform a society from a democracy to an authoritarian state, I think is the question. And I think from the research that I've been doing that I've found an answer. I think the answer can be seen in the work of the late psychologist Stanley Milgram. You see his picture. He was a psychologist at Yale, and I think one of the leading behavioral scientists of the 20th century. He was interested in what had happened in Germany because he couldn't explain in the psychological theories of the day what had happened in Germany that led to the Holocaust and the mass death that ordinary German citizens inflicted under Hitler's authority on 6 million Jews. Milgram became focused on how that kind of obedience occurs, how evil as a concept becomes in a reality, how ordinary people do violence that would seem to contradict everything they believe in. And I think that is the key that he looked at and that we should be looking at. In 1961, in a set of rooms in the Lindsay Chittenden Hall on Yale's old campus, Milgram began an experiment that has come to haunt scholars. It's not well known anymore beyond the academic world. Very few people seem to know about it. I haven't heard anybody talking about it. But Milgram studied how evil arises in seemingly cultured societies. It has much to say to us about the power of evil beingness as it expresses itself today in the United States. Milgram's protocol seemed very simple. He put a newspaper ad in the local papers, and he offered participants $4.50 for an hour's participation in what was ostensibly a psychological learning study. Now, $4.50 an hour doesn't sound like much in 2024, but in 1961, when the minimum wage was $1.15, it was a very attractive offer, and a lot of people took him up on it. Now, here's the thing. He used actors who posed as learners, and he had an experimenter who was a stern authoritarian who wore a gray lab coat. And then he recruited these teachers, these guys he paid $4.50 an hour to. Everybody else was in on it. And these recruited teachers who came in because of the ad, they were the real focus of the study. What they were told was that they were to help learners learn by giving them a shock when they made a mistake. Now, the learners were in fact actors. The teachers, who were the point of this study, were to see the relationship between punishment and learning. Ostensibly, the study required the learners to perform a simple word matching task. Milgram's protocol design, however, as simple as it looked, was actually very subtle. For instance, the experimenter wore a gray lab coat, not a white one, such as a doctor would wear, because Milgram did not want those who saw his results to think that, well, it was medical authority, which everybody defers to. That was the source of the authority that made people act as they might. The sessions were conducted in an elaborate scientific room. You can see a picture of it. The teachers had before them an impressive, apparently scientific shock generator. You can see it, that had 30 switches, each carefully marked and advancing from 14 to 450 volts. And each switch also had a label describing their effect. And it went from a light shock to a dangerous shock to a severe shock, and the last two were simply marked XX. The experimenter who was in on it, wearing the lab coat, used no coercive power during the session. They simply appeared authoritative, they spoke in a stern voice, and they maintained a kind of disinterested look at the teacher and the learner. The teacher would state from a list the word to be matched, and the learner would be asked to match it. And if they failed to do so, they would be told by the experimenter that they should administer a shock. And to give them a sense of what it was like, the teachers were given a 45-volt shock before the experiment began so that they get a sense of what there was they were doing. So they had a real sense of what was going on. And as the session went on, and the learners, who were actors, with each mistake that they made, and they would make them very deliberately, sometimes they would give the right answer, no shock, then they would make a mistake, then they'd get a shock, bigger and bigger. The teacher would be told by the experimenter to administer the bigger shock. Now, in fact, there were no shocks. The learner was simply acting, as was the experimenter authority. The whole point of this was to teach her, to see how they would behave. So when they set this thing up, and you can see in the picture a learner being wired up, and you can see also in the next picture a teacher being asked to give a bigger shock than they wanted to. So at 75 volts, the learner would grunt and recoil. And perfectly reasonable, you could see that. At 120 volts, he would complain loudly. If you've ever had a shock, had a wire or something that gave you a shock, 120 volts, 110 volts, you know that definitely gets your attention. So he would complain. At 150 volts, the learner would demand to be released from the experiment. But the experimenter would look at the teacher, who was the person who wasn't in on it, and tell them to disregard that response and to go on. And as the voltage increased, the learner's protest would become ever more vehement and emotional. At 285 volts, his response was described in the paper that Milgram published as an agonized scream. And after that, they would just collapse and make no sound at all after they were shocked. Before Milgram began the experiment, and this is the interesting part I think we should pay close attention to, he sought predictions about what was going to happen in this study. And he went to psychiatrists, college students, middle-class adults, other faculty in the behavioral sciences, and said, this is what I'm going to do, and he explained it. And what do you think will happen? Well, they predicted virtually all the subjects would refuse to obey the experimenter beyond a minor shock. They expected that only 4% would reach 300 volts, and that only a pathological fringe of about 1 in 1,000 would administer the highest shock on the board. So that's what people thought would happen, just as people didn't believe Jung when he said that the key to the authoritarianism was the charisma, the nature of Hitler, that he just didn't lead, he was. So what actually happened? Well, what happened was just what Jung would have predicted. 65% of the teachers went all the way to the lethal end. Not one teacher stopped before 300 volts. Milgram, after doing the first series of sessions, thought what variables could he add that, or change that, and would they make a difference? So he went on to conduct the experiment sessions under various other scenarios to see what the variables they produced would be. In one series at 150 volts, the actor, learner, would plead piteously and beg that the experiment should end. But the experimenter, authority, would say, no, you must go on. And so they did, at least 62.5% of them. Just a slight difference. In another series, he moved the sessions out of the scientific-looking experimental room on the Yale campus just to an ordinary office room, not on the campus. And he discovered that in this less authoritarian setting, only 47.5% would go all the way to 450 volts, but still nearly half the people. And in ordinary setting, the only authority being the experimenter. In yet another series, the experimenter wasn't even actually in the room with the teacher. He gave the instructions over a speaker. This dropped the outcome still further, but by voice command alone, 20.5% still were willing to continue to shock the learners. Didn't you have to be there? Didn't you have to see them? You just heard them. Milgram concluded that when, and this is his quote, when stark authority was pitted against the subject's strongest moral imperatives against hurting others, and with the subject's ears ringing with the screams of their victims, authority still won more often than not. The extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any length on the command of an authority constitutes the chief finding of the study and the fact most urgently demanding explanation. That's why I think this is the experimental study that really tells us something important about what's going on today. So maybe it was just in the 60s that people would behave like that. Maybe it was just because it was at Yale. So maybe that wouldn't happen today. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, it would. In 2009, Jerry Berger, you can see his picture, a professor of psychology at Santa Clara University in California, carried out a replication of Milgram's study. You can see, same thing. He recruited teachers just as Milgram had from ads in local newspapers, Craigslist, passed around flyers. He got 70 adults to sign up. What had changed in the almost half century since Milgram had done his research? And was what could be done in such a protocol? That's the only thing that changed. The change in the research was that it was no longer permissible to shock people. That was lethal. couldn't do what Milgram had done. You could only go part way. Berger's study was not able to go to the same level, but the results were quite similar. He found that 70% of the participants had to be stopped from escalating shocks over 150, despite the cries of protest and pain that the learners screamed out and writhed in their chairs. In 2022, after 3 years of research and investigation, and this, I think, is sort of the next part of this, it's telling us what's going on in the United States. The bipartisan U.S. Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs issued a report, 2022. It was called The Rising Threat of Domestic Terrorism. And it stated, and this is a quote, "Over the past 2 decades, acts of domestic terrorism have dramatically increased. National security agencies now identify domestic terrorism as the most persistent and lethal terrorist threat to the homeland. This increase in domestic terror attacks has been predominantly perpetrated by white supremacist and anti-government extremist groups and individuals. This is the Christo-fascist world. These are the followers of Trump who call up and send emails and letters to judges, prosecutors, election workers." In 2024, Milgram's research seems to me more relevant than ever, which is why I've focused this podcast on it. We have a former president who has been found guilty in many court actions, is under indictment for dozens of felonies, is a convicted rapist, and yet politicians and ordinary citizens follow his directions, even though he has no actual power. They accept his authoritarianism. Just as Jung described and Albert Speer confirmed, and the research of Milgram and Berger has experimentally demonstrated, people who give themselves over to authority, the Christian nationals, responding almost to the daily messages of criticism and negativity Trump sends out against judges and prosecutors and election workers, are willing to do things that violate what you would think as Christians they would take as nothing that could be violated. A need made very real by these acts of violence. We are at a point where we need to begin to understand why this particular group of white people who call themselves Christians are willing to do something their religion directly forbids. There is an endless commentary about this authoritarian evil action, but the research of Milgram and Berger, in my view, is what we should really be focused on. Because the question that I would put to you is, where is this leading America as a country? And what can we expect with the November election? Thank you.